I wanted to see what it takes to make the simplest knife you could possibly make. I've made a lot of knives over the last couple of years out of spring steel that comes from a spring tine harrow drag. It's very similar to a leaf spring. So I had this piece that I'd already made another knife out of, and I decided to make a kind of a short, heavy-duty bushcraft knife. So this knife is going to be 8 inches long with a 4-inch handle and a 4-inch blade. And it's about 6.1 millimeters thick, which is just under a 1/4 inch thickness. I'm going to make this knife as simple as possible. No features like jimping, lanyard hole, no guard, no fuller. It's going to have a straight spine point and very simple wooden handle scales with 2 large brass pins. Here I'm using a 7-inch angle grinder to make the heavy-duty cuts. I cut it to length using a 4.5-inch angle grinder with a cutting disc wheel, a very slim disc. Now I'm using the 4-inch grinder wheel, the thick grinder wheel, because I can use it with one hand. The edges of this bar are rounded, and that's not going to line up well with the handle scales. So I'm using the grinder to flatten that edge so I get a nice kind of 90-degree angle. And I'm rounding off these corners. When I describe this knife as being simple, it's not only simple in its form, but in the process of making it is as simple as I can possibly make it with as few steps as possible. Making the edges and the spine 90 degrees adds a step, but it will pay off in the long run. Now I'm switching to 120 grit flapper disc to get rid of a lot of the grinding scour marks. Here's where we're at with the grinding. I started this project from initially cutting it to length at 10 o'clock, and it is now 10:45. This is the oak I'm going to make the handle scales out of. I'm going to use a 5/16, which is about 8 millimeter solid brass pins, and I'm only going to make 2 of them in the name of keeping it simple. I'm using this brass handled spring loaded center punch to keep the drill bit from skittering all over the place. This material is high carbon steel, spring steel, and it can be very hard, but the state it's in is actually soft enough to drill through. If I couldn't drill through it, I would have to put it in the forge, heat it up to non-magnetic, and then let it cool down slowly. That's called annealing, and that will make the metal soft enough to drill through. I'm checking to see if the brass rod fits the hole, and now I'm going to start the heat treating process where I'm going to quench harden it. And I noticed it's 11 o'clock, and it's exactly an hour after I started this project. So I'm making really good time by going simple. While it's heating up, I'm going to straighten out the rest of the piece. This piece of scrap is 18 inches long, so I can get 2 9-inch knives out of it. So I've got to straighten it and flatten it because it comes arched like a leaf spring, and that's kind of hard to do when I'm holding the phone videoing in one hand. While it's non-magnetic, I'm going to put it in the vise and let it air cool to black, and that normalizes the crystal structure. Most people do this 3 times. I'm only doing it once. I've straightened this piece, and now I'm going to use it to preheat the quench oil. Now it's been cooled to black, so it goes back into the forge. It's non-magnetic. I'm going to let it soak for another 8 minutes or so. I misplaced my tongs, so I'm using this old lineman's pliers. It's not very good. Ouch. had to drop it in there because my hand was getting hot. I should have had my longer gloves on too. My welding gloves. I use canola oil for quench oil. There it is. Here it is, all slimy out of the quench oil. So I'm going to clean it up and do a quick file test on it. Okay, that's hard. Now it goes into the conventional oven for tempering. While the oven is hot, I might as well cook a frozen pizza. Out of the tempering oven, and I'm going to put the handle on. I tested it with the hardness test kit, and it's right at about 60. I'm using 1/4-inch oak slats for handle scales. Now I'm using the tang as a guide to make the holes in the handle scales, and I only do one scale at a time so I don't mess up the angle of the hole. This is the part where I screw up all the time because I'm in a hurry. And it looks like the rod does not fit through the hole, so I'm going to go back to the drill press and just kind of remount that hole and make it a little bit wider, but not too wide because then the rod won't fit well in the hole. And it fits good, and now I've got to cut it to length. So I've got to mark it. I always leave a little bit more out than I should because I can always grind that off. To cut the brass rod, I'm using the cutting disc on a 4.5-inch angle grinder. There's a little burr on there that I'm going to take off with the bench grinder. Here's a piece of 80-pound railroad track that I'm using as a rivet handle. That one piece doesn't weigh 80 pounds. It's 80 pounds per yard. I often screw up this process. I'll split the handle scales. I don't know what the problem is. I think in the heat treat, sometimes the metal tang warps or the holes expand or contract. And here I'm having a hard time fitting it through. So I'm going to use the file on my Swiss Army knife to bevel that edge a little more so that it slides into the hole and the other scale more easily. You can see the angle on that right there. And it goes right in with a couple of taps. In keeping with the simplicity theme, I'm not using epoxy. I'm just going to peen over the rivets like they would have done in the 17th century. Even if I use epoxy, I often peen the rivets over to give it a more secure mechanical connection. An advantage of not using epoxy is if the handle scales break, it's easy to replace them and I don't have to scrape the old epoxy off. To spread out the top of the pin, I alternate. I use the ball peen end and then I flatten it out with the flat end of the hammer, and it spreads the brass out to fill the hole. I left the pins a little bit too long, which I do on purpose because it's better to have them too long than too short. And I'm going to grind away a little bit of the excess, and then I'm going to take it back and peen it over once and for all. I'm going to finish grinding it off with a file so that I don't wreck the wooden scales with the power grinder. When you hit the brass rod with the rounded ball peen end of the ball peen hammer, it makes these little dimples. And then you flip the hammer over and you use the flat end, and that makes the metal spread out and it makes it wider, which grabs and fills the hole in the wood. This peening process probably accounts for 80% of the time of handle making. It's starting to look like a handle, so I'm going to go on to the grinder and then the sander to give it more of an oval shape. I don't want a broomstick round shape, but I want a nice oval cross-section so I can tell which way the blade is oriented. And I'm making a 90-degree spine to match the handle. This is a bushcraft knife, so it's going to have a convex grind and a 25-degree angle. I sharpened it with 600 grit, and then I took the burr off with a kitchen honing steel. I'm coating the handle with Danish oil for a nice traditional finish, and it's done. It took exactly 3 hours of work, and that's not including the time where I'm waiting for the Danish oil to dry or the oven to temper it. And you can see it's not perfect. I should have worked on these plunge lines a little more before the heat treat, but I can fix that. And you see these scratches from the heavy grinder, obvious, but this is not meant to be a display piece. This is a heavy use knife for bushcraft and survival. It's going to be batoning, it's going to be left out in the rain, and it's going to survive a beating a lot better than a lot of knives that I've spent $100 or more on. Well, thanks for watching.